Hello and welcome. It is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop, and today we're doing something we've been doing a lot more of on this channel, which is taking a look at a new tool that has just been released, a new plugin. In this case, we're going to open up the Logic screen and look more closely at Smooth Operator Pro. It has just been released this past week by Baby Audio, and I've got Michael Hahn with me today of Baby Audio to take us through the paces, tell us what it's all about, what's unique about it, why it's interesting, who it's for, and what it does. Michael, before I hand it over to you, I just want to give my quick notes on it. This is that kind of plugin that is going to help you remove harshness, muddiness, boominess. It kind of dynamically controls resonances in your sound and allows you to tailor, not like an EQ, just cutting a specific frequency, but dynamically adjusting to the audio. So just when frequencies get overbearingly harsh, overbearingly muddy or boomy, it will tame them. So this is kind of a new class of tools. There's only a few other brands doing something like this. And I think Baby Audio now has probably done maybe the fullest featured, most robust version of this. And it is priced a little bit less expensive than some of the other most fully featured options out there. So here to take a big tour of it for the debut is Michael Hahn. Michael, how are you doing today?
Doing really well. Great to be here with you.
Sweet. So I've been a big fan of the Baby stuff. You guys, I think, make really creative, really inventive stuff that's very easy to use. You are able to bundle together this idea of lots of flexibility and complexity with really simple interfaces, which is a combination I really love. So before we get into what all the controls do, can you give us a sense of what are some of the most common applications and where people are going to benefit the most from a tool like this one?
Yeah, I think definitely, as you say, getting in there and reducing harshness, dealing with frequency energy that's, maybe unwanted in certain places in your mix. And, for me, when I'm working on stuff, there's a real ability for harshness to build up kind of in any context. So whether, it's upper mid stuff that's causing kind of a grating, fatiguing feeling, or even kind of an uncontrolled resonance in the low end. I think these are things that a lot of people struggle with, and EQ isn't always the perfect tool to deal with them. And there's a lot of different ways to kind of like sculpt the harmonic content of your sounds. And this is kind of just another tool that like works along a little bit of a different kind of paradigm than some of that other stuff. And it gives you maybe a little bit more detailed control, especially in those areas that are harder to deal with than some of the other solutions that are out there.
Sweet. And before we get into the controls, and this is really robust controls, I think people who have already used these kinds of tools or have been interested in these kinds of tools are going to be interested in some of the novel approaches you have to the controls. Before we get into like how it works and all that stuff and start taking questions from the audience, can you give us some examples of what do you think are some of the most common instruments to use it on? And maybe we can hear a couple of quick before and afters on some of your favorite applications here.
Totally. Yeah, we can go through. And the one that I always really like to start with is kind of, electric guitars with a lot of bite, that like a kind of a distorted tone that's got a lot going on in the upper mids. I think, sometimes when you hear this kind of material, there's a sense that it's like pretty close to white noise if you got a lot of kind of distortion going on.
Right.
And for me, when I hear that, I tend to think, okay, well, if that's just going to continue throughout the entire song and there's always going to be kind of a resonant peak in a particular area, like by the end of it, I'm going to end up feeling a little ear fatigue. And that's what I love something like this to deal with. So yeah, maybe we can jump in and try it. This is kind of maybe a bit of an extreme example. Like it's a little harsh on purpose, but I mean, I think it illustrates it fairly well.
Let's check it out.
Sure. So here's Bypassed. So there's a real grating kind of top end thing going on. And if I just go in a bit of this 5K, you can just immediately hear it start to kind of like pick some frequencies to attenuate, but kind of in a transparent way. Tonally, it's sort of the same to me. There's just a little bit less. And sweep it around. Just go back, get a bit more of that. I'll just toggle back and forth a bit. And here I can even just show exactly what's being removed. And you can really just hear, if I'm listening to that for 2 or 3 minutes over the course of a mix, there's a little bit of,
yeah,
grating feeling that happens. I don't know if you experience anything like that, but
Oh,
certainly for me.
absolutely. Yeah, and it's amazing how smooth it is, where it does feel like it's reshaping the kind of overall tonality without feeling like there's a big giant suck down, if that makes sense. How would you articulate the difference between using something like this compared to just using an EQ or a dynamic EQ to do the same kind of thing?
Yeah, so I think an EQ, you're always talking about a filter. So a filter
Mhm.
comes with, some particular effects that it's going to have on your sound. So some of that's going to be good. We're used to hearing EQ filters, so that's in a lot of cases that is the sound that you're looking for. But sometimes it's just there is, especially when you have a lot of kind of full spectrum harmonic content. And when you start adding a lot of filters, especially if you need to deal with a number of bands, you kind of run into like a bit of a filtered tone. And I noticed that especially on something like vocals, where there's really just a sense that you've over filtered the vocal sound and the character is lost. So for me, something that deals kind of selectively with the frequencies and the energy in those frequencies that is
Yeah.
causing the problem, that's kind of the big benefit that we see with something like this.
Yeah, I think sometimes the way that I would describe it when I've used these things in mastering applications and on mastering stem applications, I would almost describe it as like when I'm getting rid of harshness, I can get rid of some of the harshness without losing as much clarity as I would with a similar cut with just an EQ. Because when I'm using an EQ and I'm trying to cut, I don't know, it looks like you have this thing set to cut 48 dB, which is like an insane amount. But even when you had it more temperate before, it was still cutting like 12 dB, but it wasn't always cutting a full maximum of 12 dB. It is some of the time it's cutting a significant amount, and sometimes it's not. So we're able to get rid of some of that harshness without taking away clarity kind of when we need it. So it has this softening effect on harshness without losing some of the detail and brightness that you still want to retain in the sound. Does that make any sense as a way to explain it for you?
Yeah, totally. And I think one of the things that you touched on there is just this sense of which frequencies are sort of being affected and how much they're being affected by. So if we just listen, for a second. We got these two controls on this side where this is the focus menu here. There's these 6 menu options that kind of expose different controls. We'll probably go through most of them, but
Yeah.
the focus one is generally one I like to talk about fairly early on because it sort of allows you to decide the kind of depth and breadth of frequencies that you want to kind of analyze and then have the plugin act on. So detail, you can think of it kind of like a resolution control where you're just controlling sort of the analysis depth and the level of the resolution essentially of the analysis.
Mhm.
And then isolation kind of lets you decide, how selective with those frequencies do I actually want to get for the processing. So like, for example, if we were to turn it up to maximum, you're essentially processing each frequency individually, and you can see that kind of reflected in the reduction display here as I reduce it. It just gets less selective.
Yeah, there's almost like this grainy, almost slightly comb filtery quality when the isolation is turned up all the way. And I'm sure that there are certain applications where that could be attractive, but as you go broader, it sounds more and more musical to me, where there's this granularity that goes in as we get further and further. But I could still imagine like almost any sound that can be made can be tasteful or appropriate or like the next cool way to make a sound for a certain number of years, you know?
Oh, totally. And I mean, I think we left these extreme settings because we always want to kind of leave it up to the user to push it as far as they want. And, if they want to get totally creative with it and use it to kind of destroy things rather than rescue them, then I think that's totally valid as well.
Yeah. And it's also a good training tool. Even if you want to be more modest with a sound, it often, for me, is helpful to push the sound too far in the right direction. To say, oh, this sounds cool. It sounds like what I want to do, but there's too much of it. And you've kind of verified for yourself that, yes, that's the direction I want to go in. Let me shoot too far and come back. And I really think that most mixing happens by kind of honing in. Just like you're tuning a guitar, you kind of tune up to the right note, you overshoot it slightly, you come back down, and then you tune back into it. So being able to go so far that you can hear a clear difference between what's happening at extreme isolation settings and gentle isolation settings will tune your ears to what you're listening for when you're making more modest changes.
Yeah, the interesting thing also is that obviously you get kind of a progression of more density in the frequencies as you go up because they're just naturally closer together as you go up the spectrum. So isolation, when you're up here in this sort of 5 to 10, 5 to 20 zone, it's going to sound a little bit more extreme than down low, which again, we're talking about something that can really work on complex material across the spectrum. So there really kind of has to be a lot of range on these controls to make sure people can do anything that they want with it.
Yeah. Before we get too much more into the controls, we already have a whole bunch of people joining us in the chat, and they have requests, so I'm going to throw them at you.
Yeah, please.
All right. Hello, DMV. Hello, Andre. Hello, Tanner. Hello, Ryan. Great to have you guys here. And anyone else I didn't mention. Andre requests cheap cymbals, please. I know you have some drum tracks loaded up here. Can we get some drum tracks sold and give us a sense of, de-harshing cymbals is often a big thing for me. And I don't know if that also gives the opportunity to look at how you might do low-end resonance suppression. But if you have cheap cymbals we can hear it on, we'd love it.
Absolutely. So this is another kind of example that's a bit tailor-made for this. Where I did this session with kind of some saturation on the way in for the room mics, because we weren't super inspired by the room sound, so we just thought we'd go crazy with it, and we're getting some. Maybe I'll find a splashier section here.
That's pretty splashy.
Yeah, so that's full open hi-hat. They're going at it in the in the live room there. So, I mean, you can hear if you just start thinning out, and for this I'm using the shelving nodes. So you've got your peak nodes where you can kind of go for, a narrower, more selective thing, or you can kind of get these broad high and low shelving type actions out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And let me see if I can grab that section again. So yeah, that already to me just makes it quite a bit more usable, because I mean the saturation in that top end, it sounds good. Like I kind of like the effect of it, but it's going to make it really hard to mix in the rest of the stuff, especially considering how harsh those guitars were. So it's just one of those things that gives you a little bit of an extra tool set to go in and deal with some of the most problematic parts of your mix potentially, right? When you're dealing with something which maybe you went too far when you're recording it, or you've got material which is a little substandard, which you're trying to kind of rescue and work with. These are the kind of things that we envision people started doing and being able to really succeed with.
Yeah, that absolutely smooths it pretty considerably. Now, we talked a little bit about the isolation control. Just so people who are checking this out can understand a little bit better, can you give them a sense for the difference between isolation and detail, and how do those two controls work together? And if you don't mind keeping the plugin a little more on the top right of the screen, we'll be able to see all the controls a little bit better. No worries.
Trying to see the playhead there.
Gotcha.
So yeah, let me see. I'll just I'll go back to that section and try and get some of the splashy bits, and then maybe we can just kind of go by ear till we get something that feels like it works for this material. But yeah, let's see if I can find it again. Actually, you know what I'm going to do here? I'll probably do this per node, because the other thing that is great here that we should talk about at some point, we might as well talk about it now, is that any of these sort of focus, comp, imaging, these 3 core controls, they can also be set per node. So any of the individual frequency processing nodes that you engage, they can have their own settings kind of along these 3 menu styles.
Gotcha. So you could be more specific with the frequencies in the lows versus in the highs. You can change the density. It looks like you can also change the kind of compression features and some of the other stuff per node. So all these changes you're making right now are just to the high frequencies.
Yeah, and maybe I'll go through them starting with the focus as you suggested there. So to get them going, on their own, independent of global controls, you have to override global with that little toggle there. And then once you got that, so yeah, there's usually kind of a spot where that's going to start sounding natural to kind of dial the focus down. And what's actually happening when you're changing the isolation control is that you're sort of including adjacent frequencies in the same sort of processing characteristics as what you define with the global detail. So at maximum isolation values, it is every frequency independently, which, as you said, when we kind of listen to a 100% setting there, it's pretty radical. There's maybe not that many applications where you'd use it, But to me, I kind of just start in that 80 to 90% zone and then just start bringing it down until I hear something that's giving me a little bit more of a natural sound.
Maybe this idea of the detail and isolation will make a little bit more sense if people understand how these tools work under the hood. So tell me if I'm explaining this right. For all of these dynamic resonance suppression tools, it's like we're taking a fast Fourier transform of the signal. So there's essentially, we're dividing the frequency spectrum up into potentially thousands of little individual frequencies. And then we are analyzing each of them potentially separately, saying, okay, 1K has gone above our threshold, but 1.001K hasn't gone above the threshold yet. So we'll suppress 1K and not 1.001K. That's what would be happening if we had this set isolation maximum. But if we dial back the isolation a little bit, instead of it affecting just 1K when 1K goes above your threshold, it'll affect 1K and 1.1K and maybe 1.2K and 1.3K, depending on how unisolated you've had it set. Does that make sense? Is that somewhere around how this works?
Yeah, that is essentially right. And I think it's one of those things where, when you do an FFT on something, then you have the magnitude of all the harmonic partials that make up the sound, right? And the timbre of the sound really is sort of the sum of those partials and their different magnitude relative to each other that, defines what the texture and the timbre are. So, for those things, once you start rebalancing those, and that's what essentially what this tool does, is that, it gives you sort of traditional compressor style controls over the magnitude of those partials, depending on how you do the analysis, which is some of the controls we talked about already. Mm-hmm. And, that means you can kind of do this sort of compressor style behavior where there's an attack, a release, and a ratio, and it's acting on the spectral components of the signal. And that's just really kind of a powerful thing to get your head around once you start figuring out how it sort of works and responds. And that's kind of why we wanted to go with the kind of depth of control that we had, because, I think for us, it's just a lot of fun. And, the developers especially had like a really great vision for this and in terms of how they, wanted to improve on the original Soothe operator. And it's actually been in development for 4 years at this point, since sort of the launch of the original. And, there's been a lot of ideas and, a lot of exploration into what we could do to make this, more powerful or just sort of more interesting, more musical. And I think we really got to somewhere that makes it pretty wild. It's been a lot of fun for me to use, especially.
Sweet. Well, let's talk about some more of these advanced controls. But real quick before we do, you mentioned there was an original Soothe operator, came out about 4 years ago. That one's been pretty popular already, and a lot of people like the sound of it without even doing a whole bunch of tweaking. And some of that is preserved in here. But this one right now is on Intro Special. I believe that it's like $50 off right now while it's on intro. So if you guys are checking this out live or in the first couple weeks after this video has come out, go over to babyaud.io. That's babyaud.io. So it's baby audio with a dot in there. Baby Audio. Check it out. Soothe Operator Pro. And right now it's like, I guess it's more than a third off. This might be like 40% off intro pricing. So definitely check it out while it's there. This is at the intro price, I think, probably the most affordably priced thing in this class that is this sophisticated. So definitely check it out. So let's get a little deeper into some of these controls you guys have added since the original Soothe operator, which is pretty popular. Oh, and you also have an upgrade path for people who had Soothe operator. It's pretty inexpensive, I think, to get from regular Soothe operator Pro. So we talked a little bit about isolation, and that is whether once a resonance is detected in an individual frequency, whether we're applying the suppression to frequencies around it or just that one frequency, and how many frequencies around it. And how does the detail play into that again? What's the difference between the isolation and the detail?
So the detail is just the total resolution. They kind of have a bit of a similar action. You can think of the detail as setting the total amount of frequencies that are identified. And then the isolation is being the sort of spillover between the frequency.
So it is pretty similar. Details how many points we have, and isolation is how linked together those points are. Got it. And you can detect it either peak or RMS, focusing on peak level or average level. And I imagine for harshness, most of the time we're probably detecting for peak level. Have you found yourself using one option more than the other, peak or average?
I mean, it sort of depends. I mean, for something like this where we're looking at transients and there's a clear sort of drum hit that we're trying to maybe preserve some of the top end on that. I mean, the peak detection is pretty important. But for something that's more sustained, where you're kind of, having to set the release longer than you might otherwise want to because you're just not getting a kind of, enough consistency on the way the controls are behaving, then the RMS mode is very helpful for that.
Sweet. So that's all under focus, right? And then our next module here is comp, and this gives us kind of compression, attack, and release settings for each of these nodes or globally. What are the benefits of being able to change attack and release on this kind of dynamic resonance suppression?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of information at the beginning of the sound in the transient that at times you're going to want to make sure you preserve. So even if there's kind of a resonance hanging around in the decay of something, maybe some of the qualities that it has are actually somewhat important for the onset. And I can see if I can show you an example here. See if I can find it in these same mics that I've got.
Sure.
I got there's some toms in here somewhere. Yeah. So yeah, this is another thing. So these are just so saturated that what ended up happening to my ears at least was that the low end kind of went crazy in those toms, and then when I was trying to mix in the close mics, it's just like there's way too much resonance from the rooms, and I'm just not getting a close kind of pure tone of the tom. So one thing I kind of was experimenting with is if you basically go in with kind of this kind of a selective node in this 100 to 200 area. Yeah, there it is right there. And you set the attack so that you get a little bit of the onset of the tom, you get a little bit of the beefiness in just the first bit of the attack, but then the release is just long enough that you're able to crush a little bit of the kind of lingering boom. Let's see if he's got another one in there. Yeah. It's one of those things that it's probably not like enormous. Like you could live with this in a mix, but just the fact that I can kind of go in and selectively reduce just that frequency content in that particular kind of moment in time with the playing characteristics, to me, I think that's something that people really find valuable.
Yeah, I could see this being extremely useful in mastering because honestly, I often do something similar in mastering currently with dynamic EQs, where sometimes there'll be a tom hit that's just a little bit overbearing, like it overpowers the whole mix and detracts from more important elements in the song. Like it's cool that we want a big tom fill, but when it makes the vocal sound small and the guitar sound small and all the rest of the drum sound small, the mixer went too far. And this is something that's easy to do because it's so fun and satisfying to make big sounding tom hits. You're like, the tom sounds so cool. And then you leave them that way, forgetting about the whole rest of the song that also needs to sound cool. So sometimes in mastering, I'll have to go into like a mid-side mode, and then on the sides, or maybe just on the left channel, try to tuck down maybe the first partial and the second partial of the tom. So maybe at 100 hertz and at 200 or at 120 and 240, whatever it is. But sometimes that feels a little bit too broad and not targeted enough. And I feel like this kind of tool, which is kind of just looking for overwhelming individual frequencies within that range, could be a little bit more precise with it than my current workaround, which takes a lot of finagling, to be honest.
Yeah, and then, don't forget every time you got an additional band of EQ, you've potentially got phase shift, you've got, artifacts of the filter, you've got issues down the line. So to me, it's sometimes, everything in mixing is a trade-off. So as long as you know where you're making trade-offs and there's, you're using solutions that kind of let you minimize those, I think that's kind of the main thing.
Sweet. So would it be accurate to think of this kind of thing, instead of thinking it like a filter, even though it has filter-like shapes here, that it's essentially a super multi-band compressor that instead of having 4 or 5 bands, it has 4,000 or 5,000 bands potentially, which are kind of automatically dialed into a degree based on how far they are relative over the threshold. Is that a decent way of conceptualizing it?
Yeah, I think you could say that at the maximum detail and maximum isolation settings, it's a per frequency multiband compressor.
Wow. Yeah, amazing.
But acting in the spectral domain, of course, so it's not there's no like gain reduction function on the main signal. So it's slightly different, but I think that's a good metaphor.
Yeah, fair enough. And then I was talking about using tools like this in mid-side and stereo linked mode or unlinked mode. Can you give us a sense for, are those kinds of capabilities inside of this plugin as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another example I can show you with these drums. Sorry, I'm moving the UI around here, just trying to find where my spot is. So yeah, if I look at this node, which is, it's kind of killing a lot of the high end, but maybe I don't necessarily want to have kind of all of that eliminated. And to me, I usually would want to leave maybe the sides a little more active on the top for something like a stereo room, just to try to squeeze a little bit more kind of stereo depth out of it. So with the imaging control, if I have the link at 0 in the MS mode, and I just process the mid signal a little bit more.
Yeah, I hear how much harsher the sides are compared to the mids right now.
Yeah, so like, for example, this would be a great thing if you have a vocal that's also distorted, which I probably would end up with in this type of session. Post-punk band, they probably want to have a gritty vocal. So yes. If there's more distortion coming into the mix, then something has to give. So if you're just able to kind of chill out that mid channel a little bit for the drum overheads to put the vocal up front, that's the kind of thing that I would do a lot.
Right. And sometimes it could be the exact opposite if the cymbals being so wide are overwhelming hard stereo pan guitars and just poking out too much, then, just doing this to the sides. I'm wondering, can we hear that doing a really mid-heavy processing like this and a really side-heavy processing like this, just so people can get that in their ears if they're wearing headphones or on decent speakers? Can you kind of go back and forth between those two extremes?
Yeah, for sure. I'll just let it play and kind of cruise back and forth.
All right.
Make sure I'm on the right band here.
Yeah, that's smoothing out those cymbals much more.
Yeah, I'll just kind of try to get a little bit more of a intense effect for it. Yeah. So at 100%, right down the middle, that's too much attenuation for sure for me.
Yeah.
That's a little more lively on the side.
Mm-hmm.
That's too much, probably. Yeah. That kind of monos it up in sort of a nice way if you wanted to go for like a more mono drum thing.
Yeah. And sometimes that's necessary to make guitar sound wider, which sometimes in genres like these, it's about the width of the guitars rather than the width of the drums. And you got to figure out what kind of song you're working with and what kind of arrangement you're working with. But sometimes if you try to make everything wide, then nothing's wide, or if you try to make everything the most forward punchy thing in the center, then nothing is. So you kind of got to pick what you want to have the spread on. Sweet.
Exactly.
So yeah, really good that we have these controls. We've gone over the focus section, the comp section, and now the imaging section that allows us to go between left, right, mid-side, stereo linking and unlinking. Can you give us a sense for, if you're going to use a standard left-right mode, why you would use more stereo linking or less stereo linking with this kind of tool?
Yeah, so the stereo link, you can think about it essentially like a traditional compressor stereo link where it's summing the detector. So in any situation where you would want to preserve 100% of the stereo image and not have the plugin affect the stereo image, it's probably you would consider like a linked stereo setting for that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something like if you're doing a whole mix and you're really sensitive to the mono compatibility and you didn't want to introduce any problems, then you just keep it linked. And then, at 0, it's independent. So that's kind of what I tend to do for stereo sources, because I just want to hear a little bit more difference between the left and right channels, and that doesn't bother me as much.
Yep.
And then we didn't really talk about the LR mode, but this is sort of, obviously the complementary option where you're able to focus the processing a little bit more on the lows, or on the left, than the right. And then the application for that would be something like a piano, where maybe you have the left hand is the bass is overpowering the right hand or something, and you just want to make an adjustment based on the harmonic content from one side to the other.
Right. So you could do that locally just for that frequency, if we're just trying to control 100 to 200 hertz on the piano, just that one band, we could shift to the left, while the other stuff might be more multi-band. Or same thing with drums. If it's a left hand hi-hat, for instance, and you want to control that without messing too much with your crash that's on the right, you could tilt it towards the left, particularly in the band where the hi-hat is, but you wouldn't be tilting it to the left on, say, your a low frequency resonance control that you're targeting on your kick drum or something like that.
Exactly. And in that case, you'd probably have to get into a bit of the makeup gain there, which is it's just there to increase the level of the wet signal. So, obviously, if you're changing the balance with these left and right controls on the imaging side, then you might have to do makeup gain that doesn't affect the overall output. So you have a wet signal makeup here in the setup menu, and then you have an overall output if you wanted to just level match between wet and dry.
Gotcha. Now, something we breezed over a little bit is that setup section where we have basically three controls here: high preserve and low preserve. It sounds like we're going to be able to take the low frequencies or the high frequencies out of the equation. So we're just kind of focusing the processing in somewhere in the mid range, or just keeping our lows or extreme highs pure. What applications would you use that kind of thing where you're filtering out lows and highs from the processing?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing with this is the global threshold, so it kind of controls the overall effect of all of the bands. Yep. So you might find yourself with a global threshold setting that you do like for the action that it's giving you across the spectrum, but then there's just a little bit too much happening, even if you have like a curve like this where you're trying to exclude the lows. You can really just fully exclude them with these filters, and that'll just make sure that you're not doing any processing in those regions.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. And one thing that we glossed over, in case it's not obvious for anyone looking and listening right now, is that this white line that we have on the screen, you don't want to think of it necessarily just like an EQ filter line. It is basically a frequency selective threshold. So you're moving up and down at what point this dynamic suppression is going to kick in. And when we do a deep cut, we're not necessarily cutting those frequencies, but we're driving them into the threshold sooner. So they're more likely to be suppressed and brought down by this kind of dynamic suppression that's happening. And then you have makeup. Right. Good. And then you have makeup, which is boosting this wet signal back up. And the last thing under setup, you have this even and skew control. So would this be kind of like a pre-EQ tilt or something for the threshold? What's that even versus skew under correction?
So it's essentially like the detection curve. So it's it kind of controls the sensitivity of the threshold controls. So we found that there's a lot of applications where you want to actually have all frequencies be sort of, the magnitude being attenuated with the same overall intensity across the spectrum. But in a lot of cases, you also want to have a little bit more action in particular areas where you hear more harshness naturally. So that's kind of like this 2 to 5K zone. We just wanted a little more sensitivity for the controls there, as well as for the low lows. So we kind of get the sense that that's where people are going to be reaching, but you do want to make sure we have the option for like total transparency. What you see is what you get across the whole frequency range.
Sweet. Now, we have a bunch of questions coming from the audience. Real quick, before we take them, I'd love to go really quick into the sidechain and output. And then I think you have one more audio example. You're going to show us some more of a low frequency source. So down here in the bottom, we got all the way through imaging. Sidechain is the next thing. So how do sidechain filtering apply in here? Is this kind of like having a key input so you could listen to some other source as the thing that's triggering the threshold? What's this all about?
Exactly. So it just essentially lets you kind of control one source with the frequency content of another. So you can think of the classic kind of ducking kick drum example as being sort of a good metaphor for it, but you could really take it a lot further because it's just dependent on which frequencies are being fed into the detector. So that could be sort of competing information. Say if you have, kick and bass, that's a kind of a classic example where there's just low end spread between the two of them. And, you need one to kind of duck the other out of the way. Or, there's just kind of endless creative possibilities too, where if you wanted to go crazy with, you had like a big, super rich synth sound and you wanted to just duck out only one kind of frequency range of that. Or if you wanted to, use something completely different, it's something that we always have fun with, is just trying to, route different things to it and see what happens. So there's a really good video from Creative Sauce up where he kind of demonstrates some of the really cool sidechain features. So I recommend people check that out if they want to see more.
Yeah, I've definitely seen creative applications with these kind of tools where you have something like a supportive synth pad that you're then carving a hole in that synth pad for the vocal by triggering the synth pad suppression off of the vocal. So, and you could do it just on specific areas, particularly if it's a higher synth pad that's getting in the way in the upper mids, that the upper mids of it would be tucked by the vocals upper mids. So I think of using this kind of tool as a sidechain as potentially, if you're trying to use it transparently, as a more gentle, subtle, frequency-specific version of ducking. So instead of taking a kick drum and the kick drum lowers your bass every time it hits all over, we can just be lowering it in the specific frequencies where they're competing. So often what we'll do with an EQ is we'll be like, okay, it's hard to have a lot of 80 hertz in both our kick and bass. So who's going to win at 80 hertz? So we will cut a whole bunch of 80 hertz out of the bass and put a bunch of 80 hertz in the kick drum, or vice versa. But this way you could keep that 80 hertz in the bass and have it just be reduced when the kick drum hits. In hindsight, 80 hertz would be a fairly high fundamental for a kick drum. I should have chose 55 hertz or 60 hertz if I want to be a total nerd. So let's take this example again with 60 hertz, which is slightly more kick drum like fundamental. Instead of just taking all of your 60 out of the bass, which is a thing that's commonly done in mixing, if we want a low supporting kick drum, we can just have 60 hertz and only 60 hertz in the bass be tucked down when the kick hits, and only kind of when it's prevalent there. So that idea of frequency specific ducking, I think, is potentially more useful and honestly less nauseating potentially than some of the extreme uses of broadband ducking, where there's almost this seasick kind of like back and forth, like swooning sound of a kick being sucking a bass up and down. This, I think, can be more subtle, more targeted, and potentially more effective, and let you have richness in the lows of both of those instruments, I think, if you use it well. All right, so on from sidechain, last thing is output. And then we'll take some questions and hear a couple more audio examples.
Yeah, so this, as I was showing earlier, gives you this kind of convenient ability to make sure you're only removing what you want to remove. So you can just toggle quickly between the sort of, the signal of what you've removed and the plugin's output overall. And then you do have a wet-dry mix, which I haven't really explored as much, but there's tons. It comes with some great presets which have a really kind of creative use of the wet-dry mix. Because just with some of the more aggressive comp settings, you kind of can create a little bit more of an effect with it. So that's one thing where you might want to blend in a little bit of the dry signal if you're kind of doing something quite aggressive. And then there's a global makeup gain in case you just want to balance it, versus the input signal.
Sweet. So dynamic resonance suppression, some of the highlights here. It's got a lot of features while being really competitively priced. I think you're going to have this thing at $129, but $79 right now on sale. Some of the unique things here are our ability to change per band some of these controls, like how specific it is to frequencies, how much they're related to one another or not. The actual compression characteristics, things like attack, release, and ratio per node. So our first three main controls are separatable per band. Actually, the imaging, that's something else that's separatable per band. Can we do mid-side on some bands and stereo on others?
Yeah, absolutely. Which, when you think about the fact that this has up to 12 bands with the shelving nodes, you really get into a lot of flexibility, which, I'm sure most users won't need different stereo settings for up to 12 individual processing areas. But I mean, the fact that it's there means, you can really go nuts with it.
Yeah, sweet. All right, I'd love to take it over to audience questions in the last several minutes that we have here. Before we do, I think you had one more example on bass that you want to show us. What would be the target that you're trying to improve here?
Yeah, so one of the things I think it's nice that, we talk about harshness a lot with these kinds of tools, but there is a lot of kind of like low resonance that, or like mid-range resonance that really creeps up, and especially with something like bass, you notice it. So let me just find my bass bus here. So if you listen to just, for example, I did like a bass amp, and a DI. So if you listen to the DI, it's just kind of very bone dry. And then the amp has kind of all the harmonic content. And then the thing that happens when you combine them is that you just get a pileup on some notes. Let's see if I can get more level here. So you can kind of hear, and
there's this congestion there that's not necessarily always there when they're played separately. Yeah, I think I hear what you mean.
Yeah, and I had this kind of active because I was just working on it. But let's hear it completely dry. Yeah, it's crazy there. So if you just listen to the kind of level of, there's certain notes, and this is one of the things that like if you're tracking a bass cabinet, it's got its own kind of resonant frequencies that are coming out of it's a box with speakers in it. So you're always going to have some resonances, and if they're good resonances, then you're happy, and if they're conflicting with something else, then you got to address them. So let's see if I can. So yeah, you can even kind of see with some of the peaks that there's. Sorry, I'm moving this around again. There's some notes that are really sticking out. So this is like a situation where I had the threshold at 0, so there's no global processing going on. It's just this node, and just trying to target some of this, 200 to 300 resonance that I was hearing when the two were combined. So again, it's just that kind of thing where, I could probably use some kind of other tool to accomplish something like that, but I just like how transparent it is, especially on something like that where I don't want to, really chew up too much of the low mids, because that's, the bass has got to live there. So it's nice.
It's so selective where it's just taking care of some of that extra resonance when necessary instead of at all times. Which is sometimes, if you do this with an EQ, especially this steep, you can get this kind of hollowed out sound, where here you don't get that hollowing out. It just sounds like the bass player like blew his nose and, coughed up some spilkus and then went back to playing. It's not quite as, like anemic, but it still
exactly
opens up where you want to open up. So great examples. I really love hearing this thing, and I've been warming up to them more and more in mastering lately, and finding how they can be even more subtle than dynamic EQs, which I've been using for being more subtle than standard EQs and allowing me to change things more radically at just a moment in time instead of all the time, which is what a dynamic EQ allows me to do. But these resonance suppressors, what they're allowing me to do now is focus in for a moment in time just on specific frequencies. Instead of a frequency area, it's selective within the area that I select. So with the dynamic EQ, I'm able to, target my dynamics processing to a general range, but this targets that down even further by being even more selective about what's happening inside of that range and just tapping down frequencies when and where they're needed. So it can be even more discrete, even more transparent. But if you go hardcore with these things and turn all the knobs up to 1,000,000, then they can be crazy sounding too, which is fun. So let's get a couple questions from the audience. DMV writes in to say, okay, I bought this the same day I saw it come out. I think it has a lot of potential. I still have to learn its effective usage. Well, I hope that this video has helped you do that. If you have any questions, DMV, about any specifics, please let us know. All right. Ryan Huggins says, this plug in particular has parameter ranges that are more dramatic than Soothe and other plugins, in my opinion. It can create some pretty dramatic results. I think that's absolutely true. I've just been singing the praises of how subtle you can be with these tools, but I think the advantage that you guys have extra play in the knobs, where you can go more extreme with them, does two things. One, it helps tune our ears even more to knowing what this tool is doing, so we can use it more effectively when we're subtle. That's number one. But the other, number two thing that it can do is allow us to use these tools in even wilder and more extreme ways that haven't been done yet. And you guys probably don't even know some of the creative applications that are going to come about with this yet as people push it really hard. Andre, go ahead. Anything you want to add to that, Michael?
No, I just wanted to say that's exactly the spirit of things. Like, you want to be able to push it and you want to be able to, use it for beyond its intended use.
Yeah. And I love that Baby is always doing that. You were on here recently with your humanoid plugin right when it came out. And that's another tool where you can go super extreme. You can use it subtly, but you made these kind of vocoder-like sounds available in a way where it's so easy and fun to push it to the end. And I think that the end play that you have in this is a lot of fun as well. Andre says, when you were cutting in these cymbals, he says, cutting in this area really creates space for the vocals. And I think that's a big thing that you were focusing on, the upper mid-range, getting that out of the way of the upper mid-range on vocals. Ryan Huggins says, wow, really dramatic effect on the cymbals in a good way. Milo says, big hello from Serbia. Good to have you here. Oscar says, sounds cool. How does it affect phase when using it on individual drum mics, for example? So you were mentioning that we might not have some of the phase issues, potential phase issues, with combining multiple sources together. Can you tell us a little bit about this? He's asking, how does it affect phase when using on individual drum mics, for example?
Yeah, so that's the nice thing. I mean, because FFT isn't strictly like a filter-based process, so I think the low preserve and high preserve all are filters, but we've taken care to make sure that they're not going to affect, not going to lead to phase issues. But the core sort of aspect of the plugin is done in the frequency domain, which means that there isn't sort of a like a time of flight problem with, or like a phase problem associated with how the processing actually works. So it will introduce latency because obviously you have to process kind of a window at a time, but it won't introduce traditional like EQ style phase shift, which to me makes it great for doing these big adjustments to single mics because, yeah, that's a problem. I mean, when you record something really kind of that needs to be adjusted and you've got like tons of filters going, then yeah, you're just throwing your drum recording out of phase with itself, which, sometimes you got to do it to fix a problem. But if you can retain some of those relationships that you work to build with your mic technique, then yeah, it's great to be able to do it.
I think the biggest issue with phase on multiple mics on drums is that whatever EQ change you get that EQ change plus also some unexpected EQ change that isn't indicated by the dial. I think sometimes people misunderstand phase and they think, oh, if I adjust the EQ on one drum mic or on just the left or in parallel, it's going to sound comb filtery all of a sudden. It doesn't necessarily do that. It just makes the EQ do additional EQ that wouldn't be indicated by the dial, I think is the best way of explaining it. It's most significant with things like low cut filters, really steep shelves. The tools that fix that would be linear phase EQs, but they also have their own types of artifacts, which would be like pre-ringing. So it eliminates the issue of that somewhat unexpected EQ, where you really just have to listen with your ears, not just look with your eyes, but it introduces pre-ringing when you use these linear phase EQs that solve that problem. It replaces one problem for another. Is pre-ringing a thing with this type of tool? That's not something I've studied at all. I don't know if it works in a similar way to a linear phase EQ in that sense.
Yeah, so I don't believe so because just because of the fact that it's not a filter-based situation. So the pre-ringing is a result of sort of the shape of the filter, right? Once you've accounted for the latency. I don't want to sort of go too into the weeds because I'd have to kind of reassure myself on what I'm claiming. But I think that is sort of the issue is that you have you have a filter with a certain shape, and when you offset it in time to make up for the latency, then you also introduce some kind of behavior as the slope starts to take shape. Yeah. So this is not that kind of a case at all, where everything's done discretely in the frequency domain, which means that there's no audio domain processing for the core action of the plugin, which I think means that you kind of bypass most of these issues completely.
Very interesting. All right, onwards. Chris Black, do you turn down any sponsors? Yes, all the time. I probably actually turn down more sponsors than I accept. I want to make sure that whenever I do one of these videos, it's with brands or tools where people aren't going to hate that I did the live stream, right? Like, I actually care about retaining an audience and making sure you guys like actually find this content worthwhile and useful. So I always want to see if there can be an educational angle that's like, how does this class of tool work in general? What are the applications for this kind of thing? And contextualizing them where we can against other tools that are out there in the same class. So yeah, there's a lot of silly things that also people want me to like bring to your attention. And I'm like, no, my audience will hate me if I do that. Go away. Or like, it's just not interesting or useful. So yeah, I actually turn down, I think, more sponsors than we end up working with. And the sponsors we work with tend to be ones we work with again and again, because it tends to be a good experience for us and the audience and them. So I really do like this collaborative kind of content. It allows me to have people on the channel and make there be more variety and allows me to do more videos. Last question here is from Andre. What makes this different from a de-esser? I think we've described that a little bit, but maybe if we can go into a little bit more detail, a de-esser, for anyone who doesn't know, is basically a really fast, usually, compressor slash limiter that is targeted on high frequencies, whether high frequencies above a certain point or around a certain point. But this goes beyond that. You can think of a de-esser as being like a single band multiband compressor, right? Which focuses on one band or one range and up, and everything moves together, right? So if we have a de-esser that is affecting everything above 6K or everything around 7K, it's pulling down everything around 7K all the time whenever 7K passes that threshold. But this is different, where when 7K goes above the threshold, it might turn down some frequencies right around 7K, and it might not touch 6K at all, depending on how interrelated you have the band set. So you could literally have it only turn down 7K and not 7.001K, or you could have it turn down related bands, or it can basically have multiple thresholds. There's a separate threshold for 5K and 6K and 7K and 8K and everywhere in between, that there is more independence between each frequency band or each frequency range. So when you use one filter, it's not like they all move together. It's just a general range where you've brought down the threshold, but each frequency still interacts with that threshold independently. Is that a decent way of describing the difference, Michael, or would you add anything to that?
Yeah, for sure. I think the only thing that I'd add is that if you're interested in trying it as a de-esser, it can kind of do a little bit more at times, or maybe even a little more transparently than a traditional de-esser. So there is a free trial available, and if you're struggling to de-ess a vocal, I'd recommend giving it a try for that purpose, because it can totally do it. I didn't have a great example to show for that particular use case, but it's totally in there.
Yeah. And I like this kind of tool. One of the first things I noticed with dynamic EQs was that they allowed me to do more dramatic things while having it sound less dramatic. And I feel like these dynamic resonance suppressors potentially take it even further in that direction, where we can do even more de-essing, but hear it less, because we're not de-essing frequencies that don't need to be de-essed, if that makes sense, which is a potential problem with de-essers, and why you sometimes get this like flattening of the S where you can make people very lispy. It's easier to avoid that lispiness, I think, with these tools, because you can put a ton of de-essing just on the frequencies that need it and less de-essing on the frequencies that don't, because it's not quite as broad of a shotgun, if that makes sense. It can be a little bit more discreet.
Oh yeah, and I mean, sometimes I feel like some vocalists have a delivery where there's just a lot of air in the sound. Mm-hmm. So if you kind of are trying to pull out some of the kind of wispy airiness that isn't just S's, but there's kind of like a character of that, which is, in your de-esser kind of zone of action, but you're not able to get it with that. I'd consider something like this for sure, because that can just kind of, just rebalance that out a little bit to the point where, it becomes less distracting in the mix, and, that can go a long way for a vocal.
Yeah, totally. Well, this has been great. We've kept you for almost 52 minutes. In the interest of getting you out of here in under an hour, let's call it here. But this has been awesome. I really recommend you guys, if you're into this class of tools and you haven't tried one of them yet, go ahead and check this one out. You can get it on the free trial. How many days of free trial? Do you have 2 weeks or a month? What's your length of free trial?
It's unlimited, but it just has sort of like you'll get a silence every so often.
Gotcha. Okay. So check it out. Try it on stuff. You'll hear how it sounds immediately, and you can try it out as long as you want. But when you're ready to go for the fully featured version, go to babyodd.io and check it out right now while it's on sale. Going to be $129 right now. Intro special $79. I think that puts it in a separate class pricing wise compared to some of the other popular tools in this domain, while still being extremely robust and feature rich. And as some people have noticed here, it can go even more extreme in some of its settings than some of the other tools in its class. It looks like Bradley Ward has one more question here. It says, would it be all right to use this as a tool to train students' ears? It really gets it dialed in, but at the same time, it's the perfect tool to use for training and learning how to dial things in. Sure. Yeah, Bradley, I could totally see what you mean there. I do like the idea of, as I mentioned earlier, when you can go even further with some of these sounds like you can on this, you can get a better sense for what these tools are really doing. So I like some of the extremes that are available here. All right. I think that's about it. Remember to go to babyaud.io. Big fan of these guys. They've been supporters of the channel and the podcast for a long time. And I'd be excited to have Michael back on to debut more plugins right here on the channel. It really is a treat to give you guys one of the first looks at this tool in depth, going through all the controls that are on it. Michael, thanks again so much for spending some of your afternoon with us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Great. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. But this has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop with Michael Hahn of Baby Audio. See you next time.